In the wildest corners of North America and Europe, seasoned hunters find themselves face to face with primal forces beyond their control, ferocious predators, eerie encounters, and desperate fights for survival. These stories show you the raw tension of hunters pushed to their limits in unforgiving landscapes. Watch as moments of quiet tracking explode into life or death battles, and see why the line between hunter and hunted is thinner than you ever imagined. Hunter Jack Mason was no stranger to Montana's wilderness. At 42 years old, with over 2 decades of hunting experience under his belt, he carried himself like a man who had seen it all and lived to tell the tale. He knew the forest's secrets, the patterns of its animals, and the weight of a rifle that could drop the deer from 300 yards. But nothing could prepare him for what waited in the jagged shadows of the Rocky Mountains during that cold October morning. Jack was on a mission to hunt a grizzly bear, one of the largest ever spotted in the area. The locals whispered about the giant, a male rumored to weigh over 1,400 pounds. It had been tracked for weeks, its massive paw prints crushing the earth like boulders. Jack had come prepared with his favorite rifle, a .300 Winchester Magnum. The rifle had never failed him before. It was powerful, accurate, and trusted by hunters across the country. Yet, as he was about to learn, some beasts were beyond the power of any firearm. The sun had barely risen when Jack slipped silently through the dense pines. His boots pressed softly on the forest floor, covered with a patchwork of fallen leaves and pine needles. The air was cold and sharp, the scent of damp earth and pine resin thick in his nostrils. He carried his rifle carefully, scanning every shadow and listening for the slightest sound. The bear had been sighted near a rocky ridge, feeding on a cluster of berry bushes. Jack's heart beat steadily, not from fear, but from the thrill of the hunt. Hours passed as he tracked the giant beast's trail. The prints were enormous, crushing small shrubs and leaving deep impressions in the soft soil. Jack admired the raw power in the tracks, imagining the creature that made them. He was cautious, knowing the grizzly's speed and strength were unmatched. When the trail led him near a steep slope, he lowered himself carefully and crouched behind a thick fir tree, peering ahead. There it was. The grizzly stood broad and towering, its dark fur mottled with patches of dirt and dried blood from a recent fight. Its massive head was bent low, tearing into the bushes with ferocious hunger. Jack raised his rifle slowly, took steady aim, and squeezed the trigger. The sharp crack of the rifle echoed through the forest. The bear barely flinched. The bullet struck its massive shoulder, but the beast roared in anger rather than pain. Instead of falling, the bear charged like a thunderclap, its heavy paws pounding the earth with unstoppable force. Jack barely had time to react, dropping his rifle and scrambling backward as the ground trembled beneath the bear's weight. His breath caught in his throat as the bear closed the distance in seconds. Jack felt the wind of its massive body rushing past him, then the impact. The bear's shoulder smashed into his side, sending him crashing into the rocky terrain. Pain exploded through his ribs, but he refused to give up. The grizzly's snarling face was inches from his, sharp teeth bared and dripping with saliva. Jack reached desperately for his hunting knife, a heavy fixed blade strapped to his belt. With trembling hands, he swung it upward, aiming for the thick fur around the bear's neck. The blade scraped against thick hide, barely slowing the beast's furious assault. The bear's powerful claws raked across Jack's arm, tearing deep gashes. Blood blossomed, mixing with dirt and sweat. The fight was raw, brutal, and primal. Jack's mind raced, recalling everything he knew about bears, their strong neck muscles, their thick skulls, and their savage fighting instincts. The rifle, so reliable in past hunts, was useless here. The bullets could wound, but they could not stop this force of nature. Jack struggled to his feet, gasping for air. The bear growled, backing off just enough to circle him like a predator, sizing up its prey. The hunter knew he had seconds before the next charge. He grabbed a sturdy branch lying nearby, gripping it tightly as his only weapon. The bear charged again. Jack swung the branch with all his strength, hitting the bear's snout. The impact rattled the bear, but it was enraged, not defeated. It lunged forward, knocking the branch from Jack's hands and slamming him hard against a tree. Pain exploded through his shoulder and back as the bear's massive paw smashed into his chest. Jack gasped, the air knocked from his lungs. His vision blurred, but he forced himself to stay conscious. Survival was the only thought. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the woods. Jack barely registered it before the bear staggered, then collapsed with a heavy thud. Relief flooded through him as he looked up to see his hunting partner, Tom, approaching cautiously with his own rifle. Tom had fired the shot, hitting the bear in the vital area just moments too late to prevent the attack, but in time to save Jack's life. Jack's body trembled with pain and adrenaline. His clothing was shredded, his skin cut and bruised, but he was alive. The bear, even when mortally wounded, had shown a strength and rage that no rifle could match. Jack understood then that nature was far more powerful than any tool in a hunter's hand. His pride as a hunter was tested and humbled. The walk back to camp was slow and painful, each step a reminder of the battle he had survived. Tom stayed close, offering quiet support. Jack's mind replayed every moment, the closeness of death, the uselessness of his rifle against a creature born to fight. That night, around the campfire, Jack lay wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flickering flames. He felt a deep respect for the grizzly, a creature that had lived free and wild, untamed by human hands. His story would become a warning to others. No matter the caliber, no matter the skill, sometimes the wilderness demands more than a bullet. It demands courage, respect, and an understanding that some forces cannot be controlled. Jack knew he would hunt again, but he would never forget the day his rifle proved useless against the raw power of a 1,400-pound grizzly bear. Marc LeBlanc had been hunting moose since he was a teenager in rural Quebec. At 38, he was a skilled hunter who knew the boreal forest around the St. Lawrence River like the back of his hand. Early September was prime rutting season for moose, and Marc had planned a solo trip deep into the dense spruce and fir woods to track a trophy bull. He carried his trusted .338 Winchester Magnum rifle, carefully sighted for the long shots needed in thick cover, and wore muted camouflage gear designed to blend with the forest floor. The morning began cold and clear as Marc slipped quietly beneath towering evergreens, the scent of wet earth and pine resin sharp in the crisp air. Low fog hugged the ground, wrapping around moss-covered trunks and softening every sound. His plan was methodical. Find fresh moose tracks, get downwind, and wait for the right moment to take the shot. His years of experience gave him confidence. As the morning wore on, the mist thickened, blurring the forest into ghostly shapes. Marc slowed, feeling the damp chill soak his jacket. The dense fog made landmarks vanish and muffled the usual forest sounds. His breath came in short puffs. He followed a faint trail marked by crushed bushes and giant hoofprints, careful to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. Suddenly, a low, cautious growl sounded from somewhere ahead, deep and steady like the rumble of distant thunder. Marc froze, muscles tense, rifle ready. The growl repeated, now accompanied by the faint crack of a branch breaking off to his left. A large shadow moved silently between trees, barely visible in the fog. Too big to be a deer, too deliberate to be a smaller animal. Mark's heart quickened as he realized the sound came not from prey, but predator. Timber wolves were known to roam these northern woods in September, hunting and protecting their territories. He had heard stories of hunters being stalked by wolves, but he had never experienced it firsthand. He shifted slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. The growls grew closer, mingled now with quiet footfalls on soft earth. Mark's eyes scanned the misty woods, searching for the glowing reflection of eyes or the flash of gray fur. The wolf, or more likely, a pack, was following him. Mark tried to retrace his steps, but the fog had erased the trail. The dense brush and moss made it nearly impossible to find familiar landmarks. His compass, stowed deep in his pack, was untouched so far. Now, desperation forced him to pause and pull it out. His fingers trembled as he tried to steady the needle, but the forest seemed to close in on him from all sides. Every rustle and snap set his nerves on edge. The growling had stopped, replaced by a tense silence that was even more unsettling. Mark's breath was shallow, every sense heightened as the forest became a hunting ground for a predator far more dangerous than any bull moose. He pressed forward cautiously, rifle raised but steady. The wolves were skilled hunters, stalking silently and patiently. Mark knew they would wait for an opening, for a moment of weakness. He felt their presence like a weight pressing down on his shoulders. Suddenly, a powerful shadow burst from the fog. A large wolf leapt out from behind a tree, teeth bared and eyes burning with feral intensity. Mark barely had time to react. He fired a warning shot, the crack ringing through the mist, but the wolf was undeterred, retreating only momentarily before disappearing back into the shadows. The encounter rattled him, but Mark's training took over. He knew the wolves would be watching, waiting. He moved quickly, seeking higher ground, hoping the rocky ridges would give him better visibility and an advantage. As daylight faded, the cold deepened. Mark's clothes were damp, his muscles sore from hours of tense movement. He set a small fire beneath a fallen tree thick with moss, the flames sputtering against the damp wood. The wolves howled in the distance, a haunting chorus that sent shivers down his spine. He stayed alert through the night, every crack and snap making him flinch. The wolves circled, their presence a constant reminder that he was no longer the hunter, but the hunted. At dawn, the mist began to lift, revealing the familiar shapes of the spruce and fir trees. Mark took a deep breath and carefully followed his compass, marking trees to avoid losing his way again. The forest seemed less threatening in the growing light, but the memory of unseen eyes watching him remained vivid. Finally, after hours of careful navigation, Mark spotted a narrow dirt road cutting through the trees, the route back to safety. Relief surged through him, but his legs trembled with exhaustion and adrenaline. His arms bore scratches and bruises from the rough forest, but he was alive. Emerging from the woods, Mark paused and looked back. The vast, silent forest stretched endlessly, full of hidden dangers and silent hunters of its own. The wolves had tested him and reminded him that even the most experienced hunter could become prey. His moose hunt had turned into a battle for survival, a lesson in respect for the wild's unpredictable power. Mark knew he would return to those woods, but with new caution, aware that the forest had many eyes, and not all were friendly. For Jake Turner, hunting wild hogs deep in the swamps of southern Georgia was never just a pastime. It was a test of skill, patience, and grit, born from years of growing up in the deep South, where these fierce creatures were both a challenge and a nuisance. At 35, Jake carried the confidence of a seasoned hunter who knew the twisted paths of the swamp and the habits of the feral hogs that rooted through its muddy floors. November was prime time when the pigs grew restless, driven to gather food before the colder months settled in. And Jake set out just before dawn, the air thick with humidity and the heavy scent of wet earth, ready with his trusted AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, chambered in 5.56 NATO, and outfitted with a precise red dot sight that he relied on to make clean, quick shots. The swamp was eerily quiet, save for the distant splash of water and the occasional bird call that echoed faintly through the tangle of cypress trees draped with hanging Spanish moss, their branches casting long shadows in the dim morning light. Jake moved slowly but deliberately, stepping carefully on the muddy ground that squelched beneath his boots, his eyes scanning every shadow and broken branch for signs of the hogs he had been tracking. The air was heavy, almost oppressive, filled with the damp smell of decaying leaves and the sharp tang of mud. He knew that beneath this seemingly tranquil surface lurked one of the fiercest animals he had ever hunted. Hours stretched on without a single glimpse or sound from the pigs, testing Jake's patience and resolve. His fingers rested lightly on the rifle's grip, ready to raise and fire at a moment's notice, while a heavy hunting knife hung securely at his belt, a backup weapon in case things went sideways. He wore thick gloves, a practical choice to protect his hands from the swamp's sharp branches and prickly underbrush. Suddenly, from somewhere deeper in the forest came a guttural grunting, low and rough like a warning or a challenge, reverberating through the trees and cutting sharply through the silence. Jake froze, muscles tightening, as his eyes darted toward the source of the sound. The grunting grew louder, more frantic, mixed now with the snapping of branches and rustling brush that told him the hogs were close, and that one of them was not pleased with his presence. Emerging from the dense undergrowth, a massive boar appeared, its dark fur matted with mud and thick with grime, eyes burning with wild fury. This was no ordinary hog. It was a monstrous beast, likely well over 300 pounds, with thick, curved tusks gleaming dangerously in the scant light, weapons capable of inflicting serious injury or worse. The boar's broad snout sniffed the air sharply, nostrils flaring as it zeroed in on Jake's scent. Jake held his breath and aimed with precision, squeezing the trigger of his rifle to send a bullet ripping through the morning air. The sharp crack echoed among the trees, but to his horror, the bullet struck the boar's shoulder with a dull thud that barely slowed the enraged beast. Instead of falling back, the hog snorted loudly and launched into a furious charge, its heavy hooves pounding the swampy ground like thunder, closing the distance in heart-stopping seconds. Instinct took over. Jake dropped the rifle and sprang backward, dodging over tangled roots and struggling to keep his footing in the shifting mud. The beast came at him like a battering ram, tusks aimed straight for his torso. His heart hammered against his ribs as the boar's tusks ripped through the fabric of his jacket, grazing his side and sending a shock of burning pain across his ribs. Thrown off balance, but not defeated, Jake rolled to his feet just in time to grab a thick, sturdy branch lying near the base of a tree. The boar circled him, eyes blazing with rage, saliva dripping from its snarling mouth. Jake gripped the branch tightly, knowing it was his only weapon now. He swung it with everything he had, striking the boar's snout with a solid thud that rattled the beast, but did not stop it. The hog recovered quickly and charged again, forcing Jake to leap aside, muddy water splashing as the boar's hooves pounded the earth where he had just stood. The fight became a brutal, desperate struggle. Jake slashing with the branch, jabbing his knife into the hog's sides whenever he could get close enough. Blood mingled with mud as the wild animal's tusks raked his arms, leaving deep, searing wounds that throbbed with each heartbeat. Every second was a battle for survival, the swamp around them becoming a chaotic blur of broken branches, splashing water, and heavy breathing. Jake's muscles screamed in protest, but he refused to yield. He knew that in the end, the one who lost focus would become the prey. In a sudden moment of clarity amid the chaos, Jake remembered a pack of hunters he had met earlier in the week. Men who carried 12-gauge shotguns loaded with powerful slugs, capable of stopping even the largest hogs in their tracks. If he could just reach his rifle and reload quickly, he might turn the tide. Backing away carefully, keeping his eyes locked on the snarling boar, Jake watched for an opening. The beast charged once more, but this time Jake dodged and dove toward his rifle, barely managing to chamber a fresh round with shaking fingers. He aimed low between the animal's front legs where the vital organs lay and fired. The shot hit true. The boar staggered, its furious charge faltering as a deep growl of pain escaped its throat. It roared defiantly but refused to collapse immediately. Jake wasted no time, squeezing the trigger again, this time hitting the animal's side with deadly precision. The monstrous hog finally crashed to the swamp floor with a heavy, exhausted thud. Jake stood panting, bloodied and exhausted, his jacket torn and his body bruised and cut, but alive. The raw power and savagery of the wild boar had tested him beyond anything he had imagined, reminding him why hunting these creatures was not for the faint of heart. As the swamp settled into silence once more, Jake forced himself to slow his racing heartbeat and catch his breath. His respect for the animal ran deep. These feral hogs were not just pests, but survivors, fighters who had carved out a brutal existence in the wild that demanded the utmost caution and respect from anyone who crossed their path. Gathering his gear and doing his best to clean the blood and mud from fresh wounds, Jake prepared to make the slow, painful walk back to camp. The brutal encounter had left its mark on him, but it had also reminded him of the very essence of hunting: the challenge, the danger, and the unpredictable force of nature that no human could ever fully control. Lucas Müller was a proud hunter from Bavaria, a man who had spent nearly 30 years tracking deer and wild boar in Germany's vast and ancient Black Forest. At 45 years old, he carried with him a lifetime of knowledge. He knew the forest rhythm, the subtle shifts of seasons, and the habits of its wild inhabitants with near instinctive precision. Armed with his finely crafted Mauser bolt-action rifle, chambered in 8 by 57 mm E-Sec-S, and dressed in a mixture of traditional hunting clothes combined with modern camouflage, Lucas set out early on an October morning. The air was brisk and damp from a recent rain, while the rich scent of pine, wet leaves, and earth filled the woods like an invisible presence that clung to every surface. His plan was straightforward: to reach a clearing known for deer activity, find a quiet spot to wait patiently, and take the perfect shot when a mature stag appeared, driven by the rutting season's call. Lucas moved with the grace and silence born of years of experience, his boots barely making a sound as they pressed against the mossy ground, softened by layers of decayed leaves and broken twigs. His eyes swept the surroundings, searching for signs: broken branches bent by heavy antlers, fresh hoofprints pressed into the soft soil, or the faint smell of musk carried faintly on the chilly breeze. Hours passed with no sign of movement, yet Lucas remained calm and focused, understanding well that the Black Forest was a complex and often unforgiving place where patience was as vital as skill. The sun, low in the sky, filtered weakly through the thick canopy, casting shifting shadows that danced between the towering firs and beeches. Suddenly, a movement at the edge of his vision pulled his attention. A figure, tall and broad-shouldered, appeared walking slowly along a narrow path just beyond a dense thicket of bushes. Lucas froze immediately, lowering his rifle slightly as his pulse quickened. The man wore rough, dark clothing that blended seamlessly into the forest's muted colors, but something about his posture seemed off. Unnatural, almost mechanical, like a puppet moving with deliberate precision. There was no pack or visible equipment on the man, only a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, which he kept angled downward, avoiding direct eye contact with Lucas. The hunter's heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of curiosity and unease swirling through his mind. Was this a lost traveler, a fellow hunter, or something else entirely? Lucas remained still, watching as the man moved deeper into the forest, the silence between them stretching taut like a drawn bowstring. The woods seemed to hold their breath. Driven by a mixture of caution and fascination, Lucas decided to follow, careful to stay downwind and remain hidden behind the trees that offered cover and concealment. The path twisted and turned, covered with thick moss and a patchwork of decaying leaves that muffled their footsteps. The stranger moved steadily, pausing occasionally to scan the forest around him with sharp, alert eyes that seemed to pierce the shadows. Lucas's grip on his rifle tightened as the tension in the air grew heavier, the forest around them seeming to close in like a living creature watching their silent dance. As they pressed deeper into the woods, the stranger suddenly stopped near a massive oak tree, its bark scarred by deep claw marks that Lucas had never noticed before, despite his many years in this forest. The man reached out with slow, deliberate fingers and lightly touched the rough surface of the tree bark before turning his hidden gaze toward Lucas. It was then that Lucas felt a shiver crawl down his spine. The man's eyes, visible just beneath the brim of his hat, were unsettling, human in shape and color, yet wild and distant, as if they belonged to someone more animal than man, tethered to the forest in a way Lucas could not comprehend. The weight of that gaze struck Lucas with an almost physical force, as though the stranger could see into his very soul. Without a word or any warning, the man turned and disappeared into the thick underbrush with a fluidity that seemed unnatural, like a shadow melting into the forest itself. Lucas was left alone with the sudden silence, the oppressive quiet pressing in on him from every direction. His mind raced with questions, none of which found answers. Who was this man? What was he doing in the forest? And how had he vanished so effortlessly? The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, and the forest grew darker with every passing moment. Lucas knew he had to return to camp before nightfall made the woods too dangerous to navigate. Yet, the encounter lingered in his thoughts like a stubborn shadow that refused to fade. He moved quickly, eyes scanning constantly for any sign that the stranger might return. Then, just as he was nearing the clearing where he had started his day, a sudden rustling sound erupted from nearby bushes. Lucas swung his rifle toward the noise, heart pounding fiercely in his chest, only to see a startled young deer dart out and vanish into the safety of the deeper forest. Lucas lowered the rifle but remained on edge, aware that the woods were alive with unseen watchers and that his encounter was far from ordinary. By the time Lucas reached the clearing, dusk had fully settled across the black forest. The familiar sights and sounds returned, the whisper of wind through the branches, the distant calls of birds settling for the night. But Lucas felt changed. The forest had revealed something hidden beneath its surface, a secret that no hunter could truly understand or explain. That night, as he sat alone beside the campfire staring into the flickering flames, Lucas's thoughts circled endlessly around the stranger's wild eyes and the ancient claw marks on the oak tree. The forest, he realized, was more than just a place to hunt deer and boar. It was a realm of mysteries and shadows, inhabited by things beyond the reach of rifle or reason. And while Lucas had always been a proud and skilled hunter, this encounter reminded him that some parts of the wilderness would always remain unknowable. Bailey and Ron had grown up together in Anchorage, both 24 years old, bonded by a shared love of hunting, adventure, and the raw beauty of Alaska's endless wilderness. They had dreamed for years about a trip into the tundra to track a trophy bull moose, planning every detail from their rifles to their packs, poring over maps and old hunting logs until they knew the river valleys and scrubby ridges of their chosen spot like a second home. Early September brought the rut, the perfect time to find massive bulls wandering alone, unpredictable and aggressive, their minds on rival males and receptive cows. They flew by bush plane to a remote section of the western Alaskan tundra where rolling hills and sparse black spruce stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with shimmering ponds reflecting a sky streaked with pale morning light. Each carried a .300 Winchester Magnum bolt-action rifle, powerful enough to drop the largest moose with a well-placed shot, but with slow cycling compared to modern semi-automatics. Bailey packed extra cartridges in loops across his chest, while Ron carried a small pack with food, water, and basic medical gear. They moved quietly through the low brush, careful with every footfall as they tracked a fresh trail of massive hoof prints in soft, wet ground. Branches were broken at chest height where the bull had thrashed with his antlers, marking territory or venting aggression. The sharp, musky odor of rutting moose drifted on the breeze, mixing with the cool scent of damp moss and the faint tang of distant snow. By late afternoon, they caught their first glimpse of him. A colossal bull moose browsing near a patch of willows, his antlers a sprawling, palmated crown spreading nearly 6 feet wide, each tine worn and chipped from battles past. His shoulders stood as high as a horse's withers, his dark coat thick and ragged, and every movement radiated raw, brute power. Bailey raised his binoculars and confirmed it was the bull they had seen a sign of all morning. Their hands shook with anticipation, knowing this was a once-in-a-lifetime animal, one that would etch their names into the memories of Alaska's hunting legends. They crawled into position downwind, using low mounds of tundra grass for cover, hearts pounding so loudly they thought the bull might hear. Ron set up first, settling his rifle onto a makeshift rest of rocks and pack, adjusting his scope until the crosshairs lay steady just behind the massive shoulder. Bailey moved beside him, spreading out slightly for a clear shot, the two friends exchanging silent, tense glances as they waited for the perfect broadside stance. The moose lifted his massive head, nostrils flaring as he scanned the horizon for rivals or danger, then stepped forward into the open, exposing his vitals as if offering them the moment they had dreamed of. Both rifles cracked almost as one, the shots echoing across the empty tundra with a sharp, rolling thunder that seemed to rattle the very air. The bull lurched as both bullets struck true, heavy impacts visible in a spray of dark blood and the sudden twisting of his body. But instead of collapsing, the bull let out a guttural roar that rolled across the landscape like a war cry, eyes wide and wild, legs pumping as he turned and launched straight at them with terrifying speed. His antlers leveled like a battering ram, hooves churning mud and moss in great, sodden clumps. Panic overtook precision as Bailey fumbled to work his rifle's bolt, fingers slick with sweat and shaking uncontrollably. Ron tried to do the same, but the bull was closing too fast, covering the 50 yards in seconds that felt like a lifetime. The ground trembled beneath the bull's charge, his massive body blotting out everything else as his head lowered further. Bailey raised his rifle again, but the bolt caught, jamming halfway closed, refusing to chamber the next round no matter how he twisted or pulled. Ron had better luck, cycling a fresh cartridge just in time to fire a desperate shot at point-blank range. The bullet struck the bull in the neck, but the shot lacked placement, and the creature hardly faltered, slamming into Ron with a force that flung him into the air like a rag doll, the massive antlers tossing him aside with brutal efficiency. Bailey screamed soundlessly, dropping his rifle and reaching for the hunting knife strapped to his belt. The bull shifted his attention instantly, dark eyes focusing on Bailey as blood and foam flecked his mouth, each breath coming out in harsh, ragged grunts. Bailey dodged to the side, trying to put a small clump of scrubby spruce between himself and the enraged animal, but the bull plowed through the barrier without slowing, branches snapping like brittle bones beneath his hooves. Bailey stabbed wildly with his knife, slashing at the bull's shoulder and neck as the animal crashed into him, sending both sprawling into the muddy tundra. The world became a blur of dark fur, flashing antlers, and the overwhelming smell of blood and fear. Bailey felt the knife bite deep again and again, his hands slick and numb. But the bull continued to fight with terrifying rage, each movement of his massive head threatening to crush Bailey's ribs or gouge him with antlers. A final deep stab into the bull's throat slowed the beast, blood gushing over Bailey's hands as the bull let out a horrible, gurgling groan. The animal staggered back, legs folding beneath him as he crashed sideways into the tundra, shivering violently before finally lying still. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Bailey's ragged breathing and the soft, wet sound of blood seeping into moss. Bailey crawled to Ron, finding him crumpled and broken, eyes wide but unseeing, blood pooling beneath his twisted body. The grief hit like a physical blow, nearly taking Bailey's breath away. He knelt there, shaking, feeling the emptiness of a world that had moments ago felt so full of triumph and shared purpose. The tundra stretched endlessly around him, its beauty now cruel and cold beneath the fading light of an early evening sky. He gathered their gear slowly, each movement heavy with shock and sorrow. He checked his rifle, cleared the jam with shaking hands, and slung it over his shoulder. He covered Ron's lifeless form before beginning the long walk back to camp, from where he could call for help. The 5 men had planned the trip for months, poring over maps of the Alaskan backcountry, checking gear lists twice, and rehearsing safety drills until they were sure nothing could go wrong. And as the float plane disappeared beyond the towering spruce trees and silence closed around them, they felt the thrill of adventure pulse in their chests, confident that their combined decades of hunting experience would see them through anything this wild land might throw their way. The group consisted of Cole, the quiet leader who had been hunting since childhood, Davis, the oldest and most cautious of the bunch, Tyler, a strong young man hungry to prove himself, Grant, the joker whose laughter kept spirits high, and Finn, the medic of the group who had patched up more injuries in the field than he could remember. For 3 days they climbed ridges, crossed ice-cold streams, and stalked signs of elk through the dense, damp forest, moving in practiced silence beneath the endless gray sky. Their efforts paid off on the morning of the 4th day when Cole took down a large bull elk with a precise shot, and the group quickly dressed the animal, adrenaline still buzzing in their veins, as they packed the meat into game bags and lashed them high into a tree near camp, congratulating themselves on the smooth execution of the kill. But fatigue, a brewing storm, and the distraction of celebrating led them to rush the job, and though they strung the meat up, they left it hanging too low and too close to camp, a mistake none of them realized until it was far too late. That night, rain came in sheets, drumming against their tents as winds swept down the valley, and they lay listening to the storm, exhausted but content, each man replaying the day's success in his mind, the air thick with the scent of fresh blood and wet earth. At first, the sound of branches snapping in the darkness blended with the howl of the wind, but Finn, half awake, felt a deep vibration in the ground and sat up, heart hammering, as he heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to roll through the trees like thunder. He shouted a warning, voice cracking with fear, and the men scrambled out of their sleeping bags into the cold, wet night, hands fumbling for rifles leaning against the trees. Flashlights cut pale beams through the storm, revealing a massive grizzly standing on its hind legs beneath the elk meat, eyes glinting with savage hunger, fur soaked and matted, breath visible in the freezing air as it roared, a sound so deep it rattled their bones. Cole shouted for everyone to spread out, but the bear dropped to all fours and charged, covering the distance between the tree and the first tent in a few terrifying strides, its bulk smashing through gear and ripping fabric like paper, claws gouging deep into the earth. The men fired into the air, hoping noise would drive it off, but the grizzly ignored the cracks of gunfire, its mind locked on the scent of blood and the need to protect what it now claimed as its kill. Finn slipped in the mud and went down hard, pain exploding in his shoulder as he tried to roll away from the bear's path, and Tyler lunged forward, grabbing Finn's jacket and hauling him back just as the bear's massive paw swept sideways, claws catching Finn's left arm and tearing through flesh and bone with horrifying ease, the sound sharp and wet even over the storm. Finn screamed in agony, blood spraying across the ground, and the grizzly reared up again, jaws snapping inches from Tyler's face as he staggered backward, desperately pulling Finn clear. Grant and Davis fired at the bear's shoulders, bullets punching into thick muscle but doing little to slow it down, and Cole kept shouting commands, voice hoarse with terror, ordering them to aim for the head if they got a clean shot. The bear lunged at Cole next, teeth bared, but he managed to sidestep just enough, feeling the rush of hot breath on his face as he jammed the barrel of his rifle under its jaw and fired, the crack of the shot deafening, muzzle flash blinding in the storm, dark night. The bullet tore through the bear's skull, and it collapsed into the mud with a final shuddering groan, its massive body slumping onto the shredded remnants of their tent, steam rising from its blood as the rain hammered down. For a moment, the world seemed frozen, the only sound the ragged gasps of the men and the relentless patter of rain on leaves. Then Grant and Tyler dropped their rifles and rushed to Finn, who was pale and shaking violently, blood pouring from the stump where his left arm dangled by strips of torn flesh. Davis ripped open the first aid kit, hands slick with rain and blood as he clamped gauze over the wound, Grant holding Finn steady while Cole kept his rifle trained on the still bear, heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other thought in his head. Finn drifted in and out of consciousness, eyes wide with shock, lips moving silently as he fought to stay awake, and the other men worked frantically, cutting away his shredded jacket and binding the wound tight with bandages and a tourniquet, their minds racing with the knowledge that they were days from help. Through the long hours before dawn, they took turns keeping watch over the dead bear and checking Finn's breathing, knowing that the slightest infection or slip in their care could mean death in this unforgiving wilderness. When the storm finally broke and gray light filtered through the dripping canopy, they signaled an emergency beacon, praying the weather would allow rescue to reach them in time. As the sound of a distant helicopter grew from a low thrum to a roar overhead, the men wept with relief, clutching each other with trembling hands, the adrenaline fading to exhaustion as medics rappelled into the clearing. Though Finn lost his arm, he survived the ordeal, carried out of the forest swaddled in blankets while his friends followed, limping and bruised but alive, each man's face etched with the memory of the grizzly's roar and the helpless terror of that night. In the days that followed, they would replay every moment, the mistakes that led to the attack, the desperate struggle in the rain, and the miracle that they all made it out with their lives, vowing never again to underestimate the brutal power of the wild they loved so much.